Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our session today on learning cycles in human learning systems. We're really excited to be in conversation with you all. So welcome. My name is Sally Hackme. I'm from Collaborate, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Naomi, to facilitate today's session on learning cycles.
Hi all.
We're also joined by practitioners who run learning cycles, and they're going to introduce themselves shortly. We're really looking forward to speaking with you all today and would love to know who's joining us. So please do introduce yourselves in the chat as we get going. So the plan for today is to explore how learning cycles can support meaningful learning and improvement in your work. We're going to be in conversation with practitioners who are doing this work day to day, sharing their honest insights about the challenges, enablers, and real-world application of learning cycles in their organization. We might not have time for questions given we only have an hour, but do feel free to share any of your questions and responses in the chat, and if we can, we'll feed them into the conversation. We are also recording this session to share afterwards, and we won't be having a break, so we'll run straight through to 1 p.m. So let's start with a bit of a recap. Human learning systems is a different approach to public management, how public service is organized, funded, and governed. And it's been created by thousands of public servants around the world experimenting and learning together. It responds to widespread failures in public service stemming from the attempt to control rather than respond to complexity. So, what our research has told us about how people are responding differently to complexity is that there are three key features of the practice. Firstly, being human, using empathy to understand people's varied lives and experiences, their strengths and their needs, trusting people at the sharp end with decision making and increasing their agency and autonomy, and relational practice, so helping people through positive relationships. Secondly, we have learning as a strategy for purposeful change in complex systems. Learning here is seen as a continuous process that sits within our practice and at the heart of our services, and not as a separate evaluation or performance measurement piece. And we're going to come back to this shortly. And thirdly, we have nurturing healthy systems. A system here is just a way of describing a set of relationships in the world that combine to make something happen. So good outcomes for people are produced by whole systems, not single services or interventions. So to help people thrive, we have to work towards healthy systems. So what do we mean by learning as a strategy in HLS? Learning is a strategy for purposeful change and improvement in complex systems. And seen in this way, it's a continuous process that sits within our practice and at the heart of our services, enabling us to adapt and improve as we go. So in complex environments, for example, we can't reliably say that if we do X, then Y will happen, or that because Y led to X last time, it's going to do so again, because every person and place is unique. So it's therefore everyone's job to learn all the time at whatever scale of public service system they work. So from senior managers to practitioners. And the job of managers then becomes about enabling and facilitating learning, rather than prescribing and monitoring processes and performance. And the job of practitioners is to continuously reflect and learn from and about their practice and the relationships they're holding. So learning is enabled within organizations and systems through several factors, some of which include funding and commissioning for learning, test and learn cycles as everyday practice, welcoming questions and challenge and not assuming we know what works, creating a learning culture that's enabled by reducing competition, creating a positive error culture, making space for collective sense making, using data to learn, not to measure performance against predetermined targets or prove impact or punish failure. And also the role of management becomes then about stewarding and governing of learning cycles to support continuous improvement and adaptation. So a HLS learning cycle then provides a framework for turning systems into learning systems. Systems in which the actors are continuously experimenting with how to do things differently. And you can see here the diagram of a learning cycle. In summary, these are some of the main phases of the HLS learning cycle, although we've summarized and simplified them here. These include creating a shared purpose, so identifying the purpose of a system of interest and naming what your bit of public service is trying to achieve. Then we move on to understanding the system, so identifying the actors and the factors that make up that system, so that we can then reflect on the quality of relationships and the drivers of that system. Then we have co-designing experiments and explorations, so bringing actors together to design, test, and learn from interventions in the system. And lastly, we have embedding and influencing, so applying learning to improve practice or change system conditions. Of course, in practice, it's not always possible to go through the full cycle, and we often find ourselves starting in the middle, going in both directions at once, or maybe even skipping a phase altogether, only to then perhaps return to it later. So just as in the following quote that I'm about to share, the reality of undertaking learning cycles is often a lot more messy than the neat diagram would suggest. So this is a quote from A Practical Guide for the Curious, and it states that the learning cycle that you plan will not be the learning cycle that you end up running. The messy difference between your plan for a learning cycle and how it actually operates in practice reflects the reality of working in complex systems. Don't let fear of the mess prevent you from starting. You cannot plan and then undertake the perfect learning cycle, so don't become paralyzed with worry about whether your plan is perfect. So today, we're here to explore the messy reality of learning cycles rather than the perfect model. Each of our practitioners has been inspired by HLS, but they've taken a different route, perhaps from a different starting point, or perhaps having skipped a phase altogether. But what they do have in common is that they're trying to learn from their work, their interventions into complex systems, and then use these insights to improve their work or influence a wider system. So for the purpose of today's conversation, we want to zoom in on the practicalities of taking a learning cycle approach. So for example, who's involved? What are the processes and structures which help? What are the timelines? How are insights being surfaced, documented, and shared? So I'm now going to pass over to Naomi to introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you, Sally, and just want to welcome you all to this session again, which we're running on behalf of the HLS Collaborative, and to thank our participants, our speakers who've come to join us for this conversation. We're really grateful to you. Let's meet them. So first of all, Jill, would you like to just introduce yourself?
Hello, yeah, lovely to be here. My name's Jill. I work on a programme called the Ideas Fund, which I guess at its heart brings community organisations, community leaders and researchers together to find more equitable ways of doing that partnership. So we are part of the British Science Association.
Thank you. And now let's hear from from Emir Williams. Over to you.
My name's Emir Williams, or M, if it's easier. It's a Welsh name, so it's a tricky one to pronounce. And I work for Social Care Wales as the Impact and Evaluation Manager. My main role is to support the sector in terms of social care in Wales to help better evaluate and measure their impact. But I was also brought into the project internally at looking at how we can explore our own evaluation and improvement work and better reflect a kind of more learning systems approach.
Thank you. Sally, can you move the slides on? Yeah. Now we have Amy, who's my colleague at Collaborate, and Dan from the Barnwood Trust. Over to you.
Dan, do you want to kick us off?
I'll go first, yeah. So I'm Dan Jakes. I'm Social Change Manager at Barnwood Trust. We're a charitable trust based in Gloucestershire that support disabled people. And I'm here today representing the Gloucestershire Short Breaks Partnership, which we're working alongside our County Council and our VCSE Alliance to be able to facilitate some of this work.
And as Naomi said, my name's Amy. I'm one of the heads of practice at Collaborate, and I'm working with the Gloucestershire Short Breaks Partnership.
And you'll obviously be hearing a lot more from our speakers. Sally, do you want to take the slides down and we'll head into conversation? So what would be great to hear about first, just what was your starting point for taking a kind of a learning cycles approach? Amy and Dan, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Dan, do you want to give a little bit of the context?
Yeah, so our project's been about 3 or 4 years in the making. So it started off with a piece of research that the Trust did out of COVID, where we found our families in Gloucestershire were really struggling to access short break services, so activities that children and young people with disabilities can access, which provide them with opportunities and their families with much needed break to be able to remain resilient in their caring roles. That research uncovered a huge number of barriers, and as a funder, we wanted to see how we could use our funding differently to test ways of overcoming those barriers. It was the kind of barriers that you'll probably be really familiar with across every sector and every piece of work that we're always told are a little bit immovable. And we wanted to test that, and we did. And it turned out they weren't that immovable. What was immovable was some of the structures that were around that, around funding and things like that. So we were really reflective of our own practice. And we wanted to model it with our county council. And to cut a really long story short, they were really taken by it. And last summer, they approached us to form this partnership, which involves us and them as financial stakeholders. So we're match funding each other to be able to test this over 2 years. And then we've brought in our VCSE Alliance, which is our infrastructure body, to be able to kind of act as a third party mediator with no financial stake, representing the sector and challenging both of us where needed, in order to remember that the outcomes that we're looking for are for the best outcomes for children and young people. And the learning cycle stuff is our evaluation method around that, which Amy and co are leading on to provide that kind of not marking our own homework stuff so that we can really embed this across our council and across other sectors within Gloucestershire and hopefully wider, if we can prove that it works.
Thanks so much, Dan. I do realise that trying to condense complicated situations into short introductions is not easy, and we'll definitely come back to some of the who and the kind of different roles. Emir, would you like to go next?
I will.
What's the starting point for the Umline strategy and approach?
So the M-Line strategy is the research and innovation improvement strategy for social care Wales, which we launched last year. And that identified how social care Wales was going to work with our partners to try and improve things with the sector, essentially, in lots of different ways, under 5 different themes around setting the direction, connecting, enabling, supporting, and disrupting. So this was a new strategy highlighted the partnership aspect. And I think as it was relating to innovation, we already collect a lot of data on performance that we have to report to our funders. We were trying to think a little bit differently about how we could govern and oversee the work of Umline. So there was much more of an emphasis on learning. I mean, as Social Care Wales, we don't have necessarily the direct work with frontline. We tend to work with organisations and staff who, in terms of support and training and innovating, but we don't necessarily then go on to do that frontline work. So we're almost one step removed in a sense. So there's an additional complexity. So we're already in a complex environment in social care, and then you've got that complexity of not being that frontline service delivery. And so we thought, in recognising that and the fact that we are already collecting a lot of kind of more quantitative and some qualitative data, that we wanted to look at much more of understanding the system and what we can learn about the system and what we can learn about our work, in a way to kind of govern and oversee the work of Umline, and get a better understanding of how the impact that we're having or we're not having in terms of what some of the barriers are to impact, what some of the enablers are, and how those relationships are building with different partners and understanding where we might need to improve or build upon relationships and just explore that in a lot more depth rather than your more standard metrics for reporting. I don't know if I
Thank you.
summarized that effectively, but
Well, I thought it was very clear. And yeah, and we'll for sure come back to things. Jill, what was your starting point in the Ideas Fund?
So the Ideas Fund launched at the start of 2021, and over the course of these last few years, we've funded kind of 70 odd partnerships, projects between communities and researchers. We've funded some infrastructure work, looking much more at the kind of systemic barriers to equity in those relationships. And probably every month, at every point during that journey, we've gone, oh, we're learning so much. There's so much richness. There's so much depth in this. We're hearing things that are just mind-blowing for the impact that this is having, or the personal transformational experience that some of these relationships are having on the people who are in that world. How, like, we're going to have to talk about this at some point. How do we talk about this at some point? How do we harness anything that we are hearing and make it coherent? And I think we finally got to the point, kind of in partnership with Collaborate, where the way that we were ever going to be able to do that, kind of acknowledging that there is this real hierarchy of evidence, I suppose, that exists out in the wider kind of evaluation and research infrastructure. The way that we were going to be able to do that is to kind of sequentially pick a few topics and just see what we know and ask some questions of the people who are in the work to try and flesh that out a little bit in a way that really recognises the fact that experience is data and reflection is data and feelings are data, as well as outcomes, as well as impact, as well as all of these kind of more metricizable things. And yeah, kind of using that as a starting point to just ask ourselves, what do we know? And then what do we do with that?
Thank you. Brilliant introductions from everyone, and I get hopefully, folks, you can see that we've kind of got different learning cycles in different contexts here. So, you know, with Barnwood, they're setting out to deliberately kind of experiment over a period of years. With the Ideas Fund, they're taking kind of data and information and kind of learning that's coming up all the time and trying to process that through learning cycles, a bit similar with Social Care Wales. And I love that you've kind of introduced the sort of data question, Jill. We're going to come back to that. Just before we do, I think it'd be good just to kind of understand how long are these learning cycles that you're all running? So, Jill, how long are your learning cycles?
Probably kind of 2 or 3 months-ish. We tend to kind of have a bit of a surfacing session, defining what the topic is, figuring out what is the question that we actually have. One in the middle where we try and figure out what do we know and what else might we need to know, and one towards the end where we try and figure out what do we do with anything that we now kind of get our hands on and grasp, and how does that get into the world.
Yeah, so quite short learning cycles. We'll come back to like how do you know when you're done? When is the learning cycle finished? But that's a good starting point. What about Line?
yeah, similar approach actually. It's on a kind of quarterly learning cycle basis, where we bring together the themes that I mentioned earlier, and you have kind of theme leads in attendance, and we've got what we've developed as a kind of impact and learning log. So we get people to kind of draft something around their work, what any evidence of impact that they've had over that quarter, and reflect on their learning, both from quantitative and qualitative data. And then myself or whoever's leading the discussions will look at those logs and try and identify the kind of cross-cutting themes that are coming in, and we'll have those on the agenda to discuss. And then through those discussions, we're kind of looking to identify, impact, learning, but also what things we can then trial or change as a result of that. And also, are there any relationships that we might need to build? And is there things that we need to feed up to senior managers? And, that's going to vary per quarter. Some people are going to have a very busy quarter. Some people will have less busy quarters, that kind of thing, depending on, the type of work and where they're delivering, because it's so varied across the piece. Um, and we are at the very early stages. Sorry, I should have said we've only gone through one quarter of this so far. So it's an experiment in itself as to how often and how regularly we need to run those learning cycles, and how often and how quickly we'd be able to feed back on those experiments. Some of them could be implemented within a quarter, or some might take 6 months to a year to actually implement and change and report back on. So that's something we're exploring as we go. But in the initial test, we're looking at a kind of quarterly structure.
Thank you. And think if we have time, we'll definitely come back to the kind of structuring and processes and kind of what are the pros and cons of long and short timelines. But Dan, and you talked about a 2-year period of experimentation, but within that, have you got shorter learning cycles?
I'm going to defer this one to Amy.
Yeah, so as well as us kind of working over a 2-year period, we're also capturing learning to inform a future commissioning process. So our learning cycles, they shift to match up with that commissioning process. So we've started with quite a rapid cycle, which was, just short of 2 months. As we move into a needs assessment phase of a commissioning cycle, where we're stretching our next learning cycle. So we're kind of running a dual process. We're taking quite a flexible approach, kind of serving 2 parallel processes at the same time. So there's a longer piece of learning in terms of the different approaches which are being taken and kind of what constitutes a brilliant inclusive short break for children and families, but also what are we learning about funding, which we can take into the future commissioning of short breaks across Gloucestershire.
And I think it's fair to say we're juggling that as well with the realities of what short breaks provision is as well. Some of our providers are delivering weekly through like weekend provision. Some of them are fixed to school holidays. So there's really peaks and troughs in the kind of activity that we can capture through the work as well.
Great. And that's leads me on nicely to kind of ask you about who's involved in your learning cycles. So maybe Dan, you wanna kick us off. So yeah, who are you kind of getting involved in? What are the sort of roles?
So many people. It's a big one. We've got 3 partners that make up the Short Breaks Partnership. So they're ourselves as the trust, Gloucestershire County Council is the commissioners, and VCSE Alliance is the kind of third party independent support and VCS advocate. But we've also got through the funding 8 organisations who've received funding through the partnership. And it's worth saying that 6 of those organisations got funding from Barnwood when we kind of did the proof of concept phase of this first year, and they've had their funding extended, and we've added 2 other organisations to that. We've also got 4 organisations that are commissioned to do this service by GCC outside of the Short Breaks Partnership. We've brought them in. So we have a kind of regular community of practice of those organisations, which includes the partners and Amy, and Collaborate Extend alongside that. And then outside of that, we're kind of trying to juggle getting a really good picture of this work alongside what the council need from a commissioning point of view, and some of that is reaching groups that they might struggle to reach. So there's a kind of wider piece within this learning cycle that also involves the parent carers who access the services, more and more the young people that are accessing these services as well as kind of wider engagement with providers who aren't within this kind of closed group, for want of a better phrase, but who are very much part of the market within Gloucestershire, who we need to be kind of taking views from, and they'll vary from very, very micro-sized organisations to some quite big ones. So it's a complicated picture. I don't know if you want to add to that, Amy.
The only thing I would add is we're being quite intentional about making sure we're involving both strategic leads and operational leads from all organisations, so including the providers as well. So having chief execs alongside those who are delivering short breaks, just to get those different perspectives as part of the cycles.
And is there a sort of intention to kind of get everyone in a room together at some point to do, kind of learning and sense making together?
Yeah, so we've just had our first sense-making session, so we're also quite early on in terms of this work. We didn't have children, young people, and families in that room, but did have representatives from everyone else in terms of the partnership. We're thinking through how we can create spaces for children, young people, and families to be involved, but also whether that's appropriate in this work. There's a lot of kind of consideration for us to give around that, but we are creating spaces at the end of each learning cycle where we bring everyone together to do some of that sense making so everyone can hear from each other.
Thank you. Jill, do you want to say a bit about who's involved and how you're making kind of decisions about who to involve in each learning cycle?
Yeah, so there's kind of, I guess, a core little hardcore group of us, kind of the central Ideas Fund team, along with Collaborate, who are present at the kind of the 3 sessions across the cycle. But particularly the kind of first and second of those really helps us identify who else do we need to talk to about this, who has that knowledge, who has the expertise, who has the insight, who has a voice in this, I suppose. And that helps us really determine who do we then go and ask some questions of. Are they people that we already know? Generally, it tends to be kind of researchers, community practitioners among the people that we fund. So we've done that in a few ways, kind of quite light touch surveys so that a breadth of them can feed in perspectives, or some quite targeted, very in-depth interviews with them so that they can really start to unpick a topic, which is what we've done in our second learning cycle, the most recent one. And then we tend to kind of do a lot of the synthesis centrally, but then share that back out with everybody who's contributed to kind of say, does this feel about right? Is there anything that really clangs? But the way that we've gone about choosing who they are is very led by what the topic is. We know that some people either have a lot to say or like a significant interest in particular topics, and they tend to be the people that we try and bring closest to it. But acknowledging that, this is my full-time job, I'm funded to think about this stuff, but among the people that we give grants to, they're funded to do the work, they're not necessarily funded to contribute to this. So we try and financially recognise the time that takes for them to do an interview or attend a focus group or complete a survey for us.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point to bring up, Jill, is how you value people's time. What about with Umline? Who are the folks that are most involved in the learning cycles? And do you think that you will ever kind of widen that group out or kind of involve more kind of different people?
Yeah, I mean, currently, as I mentioned, it's internally focused. So we're quite a large organisation in Social Care Wales and quite a large team with the innovation, delivering the innovation strategy. And because it is quite new, I think we wanted to just test it amongst ourselves initially to see how it worked as in terms of learning cycles and across the themes and capturing those different learnings. So we've got managers and project officers who are implementing the work who meet around those themes and discuss the learning at the moment. And that is then fed, like as I said, the messages and the key learning and some of those changes that are required in relationships is fed up to senior managers who then have the relationships with partners in a more structured board to discuss that kind of work. But we have certainly discussed and talked about bringing partners into the more quarterly learning cycles. But I think initially it's more a case of testing it amongst ourselves, seeing what works and whether we need to iterate before then looking to expand that more widely.
I want to talk about data, but just before I do, I'm going to throw a curveball in. I just let's get a bit away from the practicalities for a minute. What's been the most challenging aspect kind of so far of sort of, starting to take a learning cycle approach, would you say? I'm not going to pick on anyone.
I'm happy to have a go.
Thanks, Dan.
I think in our case, it's the tension between lots of different models. So within the partnership, we have got 2 lead organizations who are at polar ends of what we can and can't do. So we are an independent funder. We have no fundraising. The only people, apart from the disabled people in Gloucestershire, that we're accountable to are our board. So decision making, funding decisions, things like that are done on a basis of what the team recommends to our board, and the board tend to kind of scrutinize it where they need to, but are quite happy to go with what we suggest. When you take that into a public service context, that's very, very different. So we're obviously, we're not completely, against or, what's the word? Unaware of all the challenges that a county council would experience to release public money and to do stuff differently and to innovate. But we also want to push for innovation and doing something differently and releasing more money. So, and the providers are kind of somewhere in between that. They don't want to rock the boat, but they know their stuff and they know how to deliver these services in the best way in the way that their families are telling them. So it's for us, it's been how can we get that big array of views into the room and not kind of advocate for one approach being better for the other and try to get everybody to kind of everybody bending a little bit so that the thing we have in the middle is the best of what we can do in terms of compromise. And it's been easier, I think, than we thought it would be. But I think as we get into the live kind of conversations about the new procurement that's coming next year, those conversations are going to be a bit more acute.
Yeah, really interesting. Where is the space for kind of iteration and change and kind of and innovation? Jill, anything to add?
I mean, I think for us, it's how can you feel happy that you've done justice to a topic? Because for us, a lot of the themes, a lot of the topics that we're diving into are potentially quite huge ones. So our second learning cycle has been all around kind of what happens when you completely reconsider what research even is. And it's so big and it's so broad and it's so huge. And I suspect that some of the future ones might, it might be things like creative approaches or power or, things that could be so big, broad, deep. And having to kind of hold that tension between feeling like you have said enough and being realistic with the fact that essentially all you're able to do is reflect some of the things that you've heard this time, and that falls in two directions, and that's something that we kind of, I think, are grappling with and are going to have to continue to grapple with.
I definitely recognise that, Jill.
Yeah, mine's probably a bit more of a boring response, but it's the administration side of things and timing and resources, unfortunately. Even though the meetings are quarterly, staff are very busy, and so putting 2-3 hours for an afternoon in for the meeting itself. Obviously, you've got to try and coordinate diaries for all those kind of things, but then also people input in the impact logs, having time to reflect on those themselves and their own learning, and then trying to look at those logs to pull out the themes prior to the meeting. And as Jill said, really, I think that the time then, even though you've got quite a bit of time to discuss things, the areas and the learning that you're looking at are quite meaty, so that it's difficult to get through everything you might want to in one quarter. So I'm sure if themes do re-emerge or we don't get time to discuss, we can move them on to the next quarter, but that might shift something else out. So I think having some administrative support is a massive help in terms of just getting those meetings in the calendar and getting people's time available. But yeah, and we are trying to do them face to face rather than virtually. And people living in quite a few different areas of Wales again has its own complexity. So they are not exactly the most exciting areas, but it is important to recognise the time and resource it takes to do this, to do it effectively, depending on the size and scale of the organisation potentially. But yeah, it is something to bear in mind.
Yeah, and that leads nicely into one of the other questions that we wanted to explore a little bit, which is kind of what does it take? What does it take to enable and support this work, kind of within an organisation or a system? What are the things that you found you needed to kind of put in place? And you've started us off on that with kind of time and space, but is there anything else? I'm thinking about the kind of senior buy-in and those kind of things that I know have come up in Social Care Wales.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, the admin bit I've raised already. I would say, the most important thing to me is a kind of culture and a mindset and a mind, whether it's a mindset shift or, but that openness to learning. And it's not just if you're going to learn, you have to be open, honest, and reflective. I think it helps that a lot of people are from a social work background and are kind of used to a more reflective practice style approach. And so kind of it can become more natural, or be more, come to them more naturally. But when I've discussed it with others not in the organization, people do have that thing of, well, I'm worried if I'm open and honest about a problem or an issue or where I don't think I've done so well, then I'll be chastised rather than it being a point of looking at how you can learn from it. So it's really having that different mindset around it's not about failure or things not working. It's what can you learn from what you've done well, from what hasn't worked so well, and just be open, be able to be open and honest and reflective and have that trust that all of that is going to be taken in the same way rather than, oh, you've done something wrong, so we need to address that. It's what can we learn from what's happened and what could we try and improve things. So I think it's, yeah, that culture, and that's got to be spread throughout the organization, and people have got to recognize the value of learning in terms of a management strategy. So it's more about when we talk about evaluation, we talk about improving rather than just proving. And so that emphasis on improving rather than just looking at maybe the quantitative data to prove you've done what you said you were going to do, it's looking at how can we improve, even if we've done really good work, is there still things that we can improve and change? And is there things that we can learn from it where it didn't go so well?
And what have you sort of how have you addressed those kind of fears about, blame and kind of yeah, what sort of messages from kind of senior folk, or how have you addressed it, would you say?
I think it's as I described, really. It's trying to emphasize that it's a different style of governance. We do still have our standard business plan reporting and metrics, so people do have to report on the things that they were reporting on in the typical way to the board and to the Welsh government. So I think I could have mentioned that as an issue in itself, that we are trying to balance the more standard metrics of reporting alongside or as well as the learning side of it. And I think it's just that emphasis to say, the business plan reporting is where we're doing more of the proving, but we are putting impact and things in there. But I think this style of learning cycles is much more about the improving and reflection, and being open and honest as to what we might need to do or what we might need to change, to try and improve things on an individual basis as a team and as a directorate, really.
Thank you. So, Barnwood, yeah, what have you needed to put in place, either internally or across the partnership to allow this approach?
I think one of the things which has really stood out for me is getting some of those really foundational conditions right. So making sure relationships and trust are present. One of the things which really struck me is something which Barnwood did within our community of practice, where we bring everyone together, is actually making it really clear why we're sharing things. So if someone shares a challenge, actually, do they want someone to go away and act on it? Or is it about sharing it as a piece of learning? And Dan, I think that was a really effective kind of intervention from you in helping people understand the kind of purpose of the space and getting some of those relationships right early on.
Yeah, it was really interesting that the first time we did it, one of the partners heard some feedback and tried to go away and fix it. And you kind of think that that's what people want. And then the feedback we got was, oh, but if you're going to go away and fix things, how closed is this space and how much am I then going to share? So we've kind of brought in that process, and that's been really really effective in people knowing what that space is for. So any kind of worry there was, I think, has gone. I think there's also a lot of what Em said resonates, I think, with our project as well. And then there's some really little things that don't sound like a lot but make a massive difference. And one of those is that our funded partners were asked to write the cost of attending these sessions into their plans. So they already felt like they there was a reason for them to be there. It wasn't just a kind of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We've been really clear with everyone from the beginning what the end goal is here. So there's something really tangible that they can see. We're really transparent that that end goal in 2027 might not be where they want it to be, but it's a really good first step. And then there's also really little things like we provide lunch. And it's not, again, we're lucky with our resources and organization, but it's a nice kind of warm lunch sometimes, or depending on where we're at in the year and the weather, which you can never predict. But it's again, it's showing value of everyone's time. It's creating those kind of informal spaces for some of those conversations to be picked up that us in the room might not even be aware of are happening, but relationships are being built and trust is being built and people are seeing each other outside of kind of whatever lanyard they're wearing in the room. And we've noticed that's made a big difference. And actually, that's the bit we get quite a lot of feedback on is not just that the lunch is good, but that time to pause and see each other as individuals has been really helpful in building, people's trust and stuff.
Yeah, the importance of just of resourcing, but also valuing people's time. Yeah. Thank you. That was a very that was a poor summary of a much bigger point that you made, Dan. But Jill, what about for you in the Ideas Fund? What have you needed to do kind of organizationally to get the most out of your learning cycles, would you say?
I mean, I think we've been incredibly lucky, actually, because we are one part of a slightly bigger organisation, and kind of deliberately, I suppose, through this phase of the Ideas Fund, resourced by Welcome to do exactly this, to pause and think about what we're learning, find ways of harnessing that, and find ways of sharing that for the purposes of inspiring people or shaping some practice or shifting some systems. So I think it's really important not to underestimate the fact that there is resource within our organisation at this point in the Ideas Fund to specifically do work like this, and to recognise it not as a distraction from the work, but as the work. Like, this isn't a kind of nice to have on top of the day job. This is the important work that is happening through this.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're also relatively lucky in that if there is a rabbit hole to be found, our team will find it. So I think it's partly about having the people who are just really into this kind of stuff around it, being able to throw things around and have broad conversations. I think what we have had to do, we've got a team of kind of wider, what we call them development coordinators, who are kind of based in each of the 4 locations where we fund and are on the ground, embedded in communities, working really closely alongside the projects that we fund. It's been really important to bring them with us on this journey. They aren't necessarily in all of the meetings, but they know what we're talking about and how we're talking about it and who we're talking to, and they're able to contribute at several kind of moments throughout the cycle. I think without them, the insight wouldn't be so good. We wouldn't be quite so challenged on the way that we're talking about things or the way that we're thinking about things. So it's been really important for the way that our work is structured to bring those absolutely fundamental partners really close to it, even if they aren't present at every moment during the learning cycle, because the work is the stronger and the kind of more bashed around and thought through because of that.
You're touching on so many things that it would be great to explore more, and I'm having to really hold myself back. Actually, there's a nice question that's come up in the chat that I think we might go to, which is sort of getting started and sort of making the case for this approach. Do you have any advice for others that would like to kind of start to take a learning cycle approach and to kind of make the case for it?
I'll start if you want.
Yeah, go on, you go first.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interject. For me, I always emphasize the complexity piece within HLS. I mean, I do advocate all aspects of it really, but I think when I'm trying to explain things, I think starting with, I mean, most people, if you're working with people, you are working in a complex environment, and it's saying or demonstrating or showing that what you're doing individually as a person or as a service or as an organization is not the only thing that's going to impact on those people's lives. There's so many other things, and I think if you put that to a person and say, if I like the obesity is the one that always comes up within HLS and the example, but if you said to somebody, if you eat more healthily and exercise, then you should, lose weight. And you say, are you going to do those things to that person? Then they'll say, well, I've got this, this is impacting on my life, this is impacting on it, this is impact, all these other things so I'm aware of what I could do or the change I could make, but all these other factors impact on that. And as a single organization, you can't change or adjust those things or influence those things. So you need to work with other organizations or other people or build relationships to try and impact that. And like I say, that applies usually across the piece, whether it be social work or all sorts of work where you're working to change behaviors or change and make improvements in people's lives. So I think trying to make it as personal as possible so people can understand that kind of complexity issue and the impact and the way that organizations and people need to work together so that they can relate that to themselves, suddenly can have a bit of a light bulb moment so they can say, oh yeah, actually we do need to think about how we're working with others and then what we're learning from each other and what we're learning about that system that we operate in so that we can try and improve things really. So as a starting point, I think that's quite a nice way in rather than trying to go too theoretical across the whole piece.
Mm-hmm. Jill.
Maybe what I was going to reflect complements that. And I think it goes back to something that Sally mentioned at the very beginning of like, this stuff is really complicated. Systems are so nuanced and complex and kind of fraught with tension and, contradiction. But you kind of have to just start and see what happens. You kind of have to figure out like, what might we want to know? Who might know some stuff? And just try and pull that together in some way, because that's better than feeling like you have to be able to narrate the entire system or understand every node on it, because you couldn't possibly in a lifetime. So yeah, sometimes the bravery is like to do it once and figure out how you did it badly and then shape it for the next time, rather than not start.
I think just to build on Jill's point a little bit there as well, there's something definitely about the bravery of just starting, but also recognizing that everyone holds some learning wherever they are in the system, and actually inviting that in can sometimes be a really powerful starting point. Everyone also holds different types of data, but when we start to talk about it in terms of telling stories about experiences or how people have felt or the things they're noticing in their work, that can be really that can open lots of doors, rather than sometimes if we talk about harder, more quantitative data, people shy away from that. But actually, when we open it up as a learning conversation and it's more about kind of sharing, telling stories, reflection, I think that can be a really powerful starting point, particularly for practitioners, particularly in our case for kind of children, young people and families. It gives everyone a space and everyone a voice.
Now, I realize it's kind of early days in your journeys to some extent, but can you give any examples of, learning insights that have surfaced that are already kind of making a difference in some way? Or where, you're starting to kind of put them out into the world, and who are they? Who are they for?
I can go. That's helpful. So we kind of 2/3 of the way through our second learning cycle, but the kind of first one, we picked a topic that we knew we would have something to say about, and it was kind of on the role of the person who acts as intermediary between research organisations, researchers and community organisations, and what the experience of being mediated has been by those two groups. And we've kind of drawn that together into a bit of an insights report, which is now published and out in the world, and hopefully going to shape the way that people think about who is effective in those roles, how are they better supported, and the kind of the ways that they work, which really support particularly community groups, but also researchers in building those relationships and being really effective. So we're kind of having conversations with people on the basis of what we've put out into the world now, which are quite interesting about both their experience, but also the kind of, we want to employ someone like this. How do we do it?
Yeah, so in that case, the learning from that cycle is really you're trying to put it out to try and influence the wider system and the way the wider system works. Yeah, what about, again, early days, I know, but Amy, Dan, anything you can share?
I think ours is still at a really, really early stage in terms of that. I think where we're probably seeing it most live at the moment is within the three partners, and the real value of Collaborate and of Amy's expertise and experience, as well as somebody with a commissioning background, where she can speak the language of commissioners, so that actually what we're seeing through the learning cycle at the moment is a bit of a breaking down of some of those kind of guards and stuff that each organization has maybe had, going into this work. So just a more openness to be able to be critical of practice, or is in both kind of looking for the pros and cons as well as criticizing where it's necessary. Of being able to be really transparent about what the barriers are and the blockers are, and starting to use the learning cycle language to be able to kind of encourage those conversations to come out of the kind of small partnership group and into the kind of bigger providers forum that we're creating, and the county are also creating around the procurement process. So we're seeing it in that sense more around probably a culture change. I don't know if that's a little bit too strong, but in that kind of sense at the moment. And then these kind of platforms and the work going forward is where we hope to sort of disseminate the wider learning. But I think we're a few, probably about a year away from that fully.
I think we're kind of intentionally, kind of unintentionally, but taking kind of a bit of an experiential approach to the way we're taking things forward. So all of the conversations we're part of, we're shaping them as kind of those learning conversations. Like Dan said, I previously worked as a commissioner, so I can act as a bit of a bridge between different partners and do some kind of translation in the room. And then we're starting to see how some of that kind of modeling or experience of being in learning spaces is showing up elsewhere in other conversations that people are part of, which is really interesting to see how that's been taken forward.
So lots about the kind of the change that happens within the learning space, rather than the kind of the output or the kind of the product. Yeah, Emma, it might feel too soon, but what would you hope what would you hope for from the inline learning cycles?
Yeah, sorry, it's a tricky one for me because I helped to set things up with yourselves, and then I had a hip replacement operation, so I was off for 2 months, so missed the first kind of quarter in reporting, so I haven't got much that I can comment on in terms of that. I suppose I think it's that internal change in terms of seeing the value, and that, you know, as others have just reiterated, that openness and learning kind of emphasis. And then, yeah, I think it's that experimental approach, really. So identifying, you know, what's for individuals, what they're learning, for the teams and across the themes, what we're learning, and really kind of looking at what we can change in a, you know, are there any quick changes that we can make? Are there quick changes we can make as an organization? But also the relationship piece, I think, will be really important in terms of identifying those relationships with partners. How are those relationships progressing, and where might we need to improve, or where might we need to adapt, in terms of our own work, in terms of building relationships, and also thinking about you know, the outcomes, the way that people measure outcomes. We got a heavy emphasis on storytelling, human-centered approaches, that kind of thing, gathering stories. So it's just thinking about that way to gather data differently, and how you then analyze that and learn from that. So it's, yeah, I don't know if that fully captures everything, but it's kind of just, it's it's all pieces of the puzzle that I think all take time to adapt and come together and for people to reflect on. But yeah, those are the things I hope to see in the future. And then from that, like you say, hopefully improved outcomes through really positive changes, really.
Thank you so much to all four of you. It's been a really interesting conversation and lots of rabbit holes that we could have gone down, but we've run out of time. So I'm just going to ask Sally to quickly pop a slide up. If you want to continue these conversations about learning, we have 3 additional sessions coming up on the 9th, 16th, and the 20th of November, when we'll be digging into some more of the kind of different aspects of learning cycles, again, hopefully very practically oriented. So use the QR code here to sign up. And also, if you're not already receiving Collaborate's newsletter, then do sign up for our newsletter as well. So yeah, it just leaves me to say thank you so much for joining us this lunchtime. And if you'd like to show your appreciation for our kind of practitioners who've given up their time to share with you, then please do that with the reaction buttons, or if you'd like to unmute and give them a clap, you can also do that. But thanks so much for being with us, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.